Welcome to MetroSTL. I'm Charles Jaco. We're pleased to be joined today by Alderman Cara Spencer, one of the two candidates in the April election to become the next mayor of St. Louis. Alderman, thank you very much for being with us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me anytime.
Um, Basic question. St. Louis has the 13th highest murder rate of any city over 50,000 population on the face of the earth. It has the largest building abandonment and population loss of any metropolitan area in North American history. The problems go on and on. It has a budget so squeezed that it can barely afford to buy new garbage trucks. I guess my basic question is, why in the name of heaven would you want to become mayor of a city like this?
Oh, you're absolutely right. We have such challenges. We absolutely do, but we have incredible infrastructure. Our built environment is second to none. The historical assets that we have here are incredible, the cultural assets, and of course, the people. We're located strategically right here on the largest river in the United States. And so we're, of course, a city that is the underdog, if you will, but the potential is limitless. And so I'm running to serve as our city's next mayor to turn the tides, to turn the direction and help our community, our city, our region become one that is growing again.
What would you say is the primary difference between you and your opponent, Treasurer Tashara Jones? You've both been painted as progressives, a good deal to the left of the standard political operatives in the city of St. Louis, and in some cases almost the same person. Where, in terms of policy and how you would turn the city around, do you feel you differ most significantly?
Sure. Well, I mean, I would really, while our policy perspectives overlap in some significant ways, I would really, point to our approach to how we get things done. I mean, we were both opposed to airport privatization, and I took a hands-on, dogged approach to opposing that. From attending every single meeting to really digging into the federal legislation to communicating directly with the FAA and to communicating directly, not just through Twitter, but in a very meaningful, constructive manner with the media and the general public, and educating folks on what that project was. And if I'm elected mayor, I'm going to take a hands-on approach to turning our city around, changing the narrative of the city, and getting in and addressing the number one issue which is facing our city, and that's violence, and taking a real hands-on constructive approach. And you can take a look at my record, and it really shows my real commitment to doing the hard work of leading and turning our city around.
Well, again, specifically, how does that differ from the treasurer? For example, when you say hands-on, am I to take that to mean that you don't think that she is in the trenches being hands-on? Explain that to me.
Well, look, I mean, I'm not here to tell you how the treasurer has governed or her department there, but really, I mean, I think my record speaks for itself. The hands-on approach of really getting in and doing the hard work of changing the narrative of our city. And then when I talk about airport privatization, I don't think it's any secret to your listeners or your watchers that I was really leading that effort. I didn't just sit on the sidelines and be opposed to it. I really got in hands-on, communicated, went to community meetings, neighborhood meetings, and talked to people, helped educate the population, and really dug into the specifics of why it was a bad deal. And I will take the same approach to other issues throughout the city. And when we look at violence, I have a constructive 10-point plan that really outlines for our residents how, if elected mayor, I will address violence in a very specific, outlined manner. And that's a real difference in our approach.
Well, with all due respect, having read both of your platforms, the treasurer seems to be very specific about a number of things, including choosing the next police chief from outside of the St. Louis area, that the next director of public safety should not have anything to do with the St. Louis area, should be a fresh set of eyes. So there seems to be a lot of specificity there. I'm just wondering, though, if someone believes that there is a sense of urgency in the city of St. Louis to turn things around, that we've dropped below 300,000 population, that this is a crisis, that violence is rampant. Besides saying you're, quote, hands-on, substantively, why should they vote for you rather than than your opponent, since you both seem to be talking about the same things, talking about criminal justice reform, talking about police reform, talking about airport privatization, talking about a number of things. But why specifically, in terms of running this city, would you be the better choice to turn these problems around than the treasurer?
Sure. Well, I mean, again, I mean, this is what democracy is. It's about voting and empowering people to make that decision. But I take, again, a very hands-on approach, and have outlined my very clearly stated values, and not just values, but real approach to how we're going to get things done. And I would encourage you to go back and look at those two platforms. And mine is very, very specific, not just when it comes to the public safety piece, but the education piece, really outlining very specifically, not just value statements, but very constructive path for how we are going to turn around violence in the city of St. Louis.
Okay, for those who have not taken the time to read your policy positions
Mhm.
on violence, we are just coming off of a case several days ago where a 9-year-old boy was shot and killed south of downtown. For 30 years, St. Louis has been killing children at a rate 10 times the national average to gun violence. This is not something that came from the Slay administration or the Harmon administration or the Bosley administration. This is something that has been almost baked into the cake in St. Louis since the 1970s. Specifically, and again, for those who have not looked at your platform, what would you do in terms of violence, in terms of policing, in terms of intervention to stop the violence in St. Louis?
Yeah, I mean, we have to have clear, decisive path through this and decisive leadership. And that's where, I'll go through a little bit here for those of you who haven't been able to, check out the platform on my website that describes this. But, when I launched this campaign, I recognized that the number one issue plaguing our city and our communities is violence. And I went to other cities to look at what is effectively reducing violence in other communities. And make no mistake, St. Louis is standing out like a sore thumb by failing to really reduce violence in our neighborhood. So number one, we bring those programs that success to St. Louis. And that looks like taking the tried and true data-driven approach that's been successful in Oakland, that's been successful in Boston, other cities. Focused deterrence is the number one program that really has immediate results to address violence. We have brought in Cure Violence here in St. Louis. That's a program that has a long-term impact, but focused deterrence allows our community, which includes a organized approach, including the police department, the circuit attorney, our service providers, who identifying those individuals who are at the highest risk of being involved in violence and addressing them head on. It has immediate results. It's even been proven to work here in St. Louis. We brought a pilot program here in 2012. So if elected mayor, first step is bringing focused deterrence and a constructive long-term approach to St. Louis. We're going to engage in more effective policing and maximize intelligence within our police department, addressing some of the major deficits outlined in the recent Teneo report commissioned by Civic Progress, get our policing up to 21st century standards. And we're going to go beyond our police department by shoring up some of those other departments. It looks like putting in place a problem landlord unit to hold absentee problem landlords accountable for the illegal activity taking place on their properties, the degradation of communities associated with vacancy. We're going to be putting in a comprehensive 911 program so we can answer every 911 call. I mean, look, there are so many deficits associated with public safety in the city of St. Louis that it's mind-blowing. The fact that we're not answering 30% of our 911 calls right now is unacceptable. And we're going to get those basics right and then move on to building trust within our communities and recognizing that when our communities don't trust our law enforcement, they don't share the vital information our law enforcement agencies need to solve violence in our community.
When you talk about focused deterrence, how would that appreciably differ from what Chief Hayden and others have done with so-called hotspot policing and flooding the zone, if you will, of high crime areas with a lot of cops, which is only a temporary expedient, but from what's already being done?
So you're kind of cutting out here, so I'm going to read between the lines, and I think I know where you're going with this, Charles. So the the approach that we've taken right now is flooding the zone, that geographical focus on the hotspots where you see a lot of violence. That's a geographical focus of policing resources. Focused deterrence reorients that from being geographical in nature and focuses instead on the very small number of individuals at high risk of being involved in violence. I live in one of those rectangles, and I can tell you that the vast majority of residents who live in those communities, including my own, are law-abiding citizens, and sweeping them all into a hyper-policing state is not only continuing the divide between between our communities and our police department, but it's really ineffective because, again, it's only a very small number of people that are involved in violence. So shifting that from being a geographical focus to being one that is focused on those small number of individuals, that's where focused deterrence comes in. It's much more effective, and it's much more efficient use of tax dollars. So the focus is much more beneficial in the short and long term at addressing violence.
Now, you touched on this briefly, the relations between the St. Louis Police Department and the community. In the minds of some, the St. Louis Police Department is not an exceptionally effective law enforcement organization because in some high crime neighborhoods, Jeff Land, Vanderloo, the Ville, there are arrests made fewer than 1/3 of the time in murder cases.
Yes.
Do you think the problem here largely is you've got a systemically ineffective police department?
Look, there's a lot of issues. One, we don't have an overall strategy for dealing with violence. That's very clear. That deficit, the lacking of a department-wide strategy for dealing with violence is really doing two things. It's one, it's failing to address violence strategically, and two, putting our officers, their lives at risk, putting them out there on the streets without a strategy for dealing with violence. Number two, we are failing to have any sort of communication within our police department and across departments. That failure to have a policy for sharing intelligence is inexcusable. And it really breaks down our ability to get to the bottom of who is responsible for the violent activity that is taking place in our communities. We cannot solve violence without a protocol for basic sharing of intelligence within our police department. And that deficit was very clearly outlined in that Teneo report I mentioned. We do not have a policy. It relies on personal relationships within our police department. Can you believe that? You have to be friends with the other guy in the department or the other woman to be able to get the intelligence that you need to share the intelligence to solve violence. So addressing those deficits is going to be key to making our police department function on a very basic level. But I do also recognize, and we need to all understand, that trust is a key component to solving violence. When the witnesses and victims of violent crime do not share the information with our police, we don't trust the police department, they're not going to share the vital information that our law enforcement agencies need to solve violence. So improving trust is got to be a key component to a successful strategy for addressing violence.
How do you improve that trust in a city police department that has a reputation for racist behavior?
Yes.
The city recently got nailed with a $5 million settlement because white cops beat up a black undercover officer and then covered it up.
Yeah.
You've had lawsuits that are pending from the Jason Stockley protests that look like they could cost the city a lot more, from postings on Cop Talk, the police officers' message board, on through the Facebook postings from 2 years ago that were incredibly racist, on through many of the things that Jeff Ruda, the business manager for the police union, said, have led a lot of Black St. Louisans and many white St. Louisans to conclude that this is a fundamentally racist police department. And there's no wonder that people don't trust it. Number one, is that a correct assumption? And number two, if it is or it isn't, how do you overcome that hurdle to have people cooperate with the police when they don't trust them?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that systemic racism exists in all constructs of humanity, and certainly here in St. Louis, where we have such deep racial divisions. And I would not excuse any department or any city agency from that, including the police department. And so it has to be the role and responsibility of our government to root out racism. Your question about how to really develop trust, and with that in mind, first, there are some constructive things that the next mayor needs to do. If I'm elected, here's what I'll do. First, by recognizing that we are number one, not just in homicides in the streets in our neighborhoods, we're number one for police involved homicides in the nation by a long shot. And this is a real problem. If I'm elected mayor, I will update our use of force policies, which will clearly articulate a commitment to the reverence of life and reorient those policies related to use of force within our police department. I'm committed to creating an Office of Equity and Inclusion, and this chief equity officer will be responsible for overseeing department policies, promotions, hiring, and that sort of thing to really reorient some of our policing. And I'm committed to hiring licensed social workers to really foster better relationship within our communities. It's not always that we need an officer with a gun responding to issues of emergency in our communities. And sometimes we need to communicate. We often, almost always, need to communicate better with those witnesses and victims of violence in our neighborhoods. And lastly, I am committed to doing the hard work of getting the basics right. And that means doing simple things like picking up the phone. We are failing to get those very basic fundamental aspects of public safety right as of right now. Over 30% of our 911 calls are not being answered by a human being. They're being answered by a recording that instructs the listener that all operators are busy. And when you're experiencing a life-threatening emergency, or any kind of emergency for that matter, that is simply unacceptable. So identifying that issue and a commitment to getting it done and getting it fixed is got to be a priority of the next administration.
You talked about, pardon me, you talked about the racial divide in St. Louis. I mean, let's face it, for decades, for many white politicians, the northern city limits has been Del Mar. North St. Louis is disintegrating. Fewer than 75,000 people out of the city now live north of Del Mar, according to the latest Census Bureau estimates. The African-American population of St. Louis has dropped by 14% over the past decade as Black people who can afford to or who are able to move out of North St. Louis, either other parts of the city, St. Louis County, or out of the region, simply because the infrastructure and the city services have collapsed in that northern one half of the geographical area of the city. What do you think needs to be done to deal with that problem?
We have to get serious about investing in North St. Louis. I mean, this is a really serious issue that has been at play for a long, long time. Our region, and it's bigger than just the city. I mean, the St. Louis region has stagnated for 4 decades. We haven't grown an iota in that time. And during those same years of regional population stagnation, the areas west of us, Wentzville, St. Charles, have been growing at gangbuster speed, which has really hollowed out the city and really left here within the city of St. Louis a population that is largely low to moderate income. We have a lot of folks who are living out of below poverty line. In fact, 30% of our population is, which is 3 times the national average, 3 times the regional average. And so we have a tax base here, a set of residents that we're straddling with upkeeping the infrastructure of a city that was built for almost 4 times our current population. So we have to develop a regional strategy to grow our population first and foremost. But that's a long-term strategy. Right here, right now, we need to hold those property owners that are holding and parking their financial assets here in the city of St. Louis accountable. And that's where somebody like Paul McKee needs to have their feet held to the fire. I, as an alderman, passed an ordinance just 2 years ago to finally hold him responsible for building code violations that he was up until that point, forgiven for. That's unacceptable. We need to be holding those landholders accountable and making just sitting on property in St. Louis totally financially disincentivized proposition for folks so that we can get those things moving. Look, we have a lot of opportunity in our infrastructure, and putting them in the hands of everyday citizens, our families to live in, is the way to go here.
Alderman Cara Spencer, one of the 2 candidates for mayor in the upcoming April mayoral election. Alderman, it was our pleasure. Thank you very much